our electorate.
Of course. No, of course. You're absolutely right. It certainly was. Manny, thank you. We reported on it earlier. In
Yeah.
fact, we played some of the Channel 4 report and some of the quotes from Christopher Wiley regarding Steve Bannon. So, no, we're all over it. We'll talk about it more in the next half hour. I got to get to my guest, though. Okay,
See
man?
ya.
All
All
right.
right, man. Take care.
Good to hear from you. Thank you so much. 866-99-SIRIUS, 866-997-4748. So just kind of continuing our conversation when it comes to issues of race. We talked about St. Patrick's Day, and again, we encourage people to follow Zahir Ali and Natasha Varner and Liam Hogan on Twitter, as they've been talking about some of the history of the Irish and African Americans over the course of the weekend, positive and negative. The tension that exists, we're now going to discuss why that tension really makes no sense at all. Joining us now from National Geographic is Elizabeth Kolbert. Elizabeth, good morning. How are you? How are you this morning?
I'm fine, thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Well, first of all, I guess we should, and let me just mention, Elizabeth has been a staff writer at The New Yorker since 1999. Her most recent book is The Sixth Extinction and Unnatural History. Let's start this way. First of all, your piece is timely. In fact, Nat Geo immediately links to your piece in its recent acknowledgement in the race issue that for decades Nat Geo's coverage was racist. Can you speak to that just a little bit, please?
Sure. Well, National Geographic has it's online. It's available online right now. It will be out in paper, I guess, next week on the newsstands. Put out a whole special issue on race, and I guess you'd say the centerpiece of that issue is a piece not by me, but by the editor of the magazine, Susan Goldberg, that looks at the history of National Geographic's coverage and draws some, pretty. It's really a mea culpa, I guess, and looks at how National Geographic is over a century old and has, as the editor pointed out, was often people's first introduction to various parts of the world and to other peoples around the world. And so this piece looks at that coverage and at the way that people of different races, non-white races, I guess you'd say, were treated on the pages of National Geographic, and takes sort of, steps up to the plate and takes some responsibility for that coverage not having been very, I don't know, sensitive is kind of almost too weak a word. Has that accurate even?
Yeah, no, but and folks, you can see on our screen as we're streaming on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Make it plain. The editor-in-chief's piece and some of the acknowledgments of some of the ways in which National Geographic portrayed people of color as primitive, for lack of a better word, savage. So it's very important for National Geographic to make this acknowledgement. But then we take a look at your piece, Elizabeth, along with this, and she links directly to your piece. There's no scientific basis for race. It's a made-up label, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, when we look at, we've had a pretty complete look at the human, genome for certainly since 2001 when the results of the Human Genome Project were announced, but even longer, really, we've had a pretty good idea of what the human genome looks like, and we've learned a lot of really interesting things from that about human history and why there are people who are look different. And one of the conclusions of that history is that race is really not a category that you see in genetics. You see that people have different ancestries. People have their families come from different parts of the world clearly, and there are clearly visible differences among us. But if you look at people on the genetic level, a race is just not a category that really makes a lot of sense.
And as a matter of fact, as you write, all of us come from Africa, don't we?
Oh yes, absolutely. Our species, Homo sapiens, or sometimes called Homo sapiens sapiens, to distinguish us from other human species, with which we actually is now also clear from looking at genetics. People interbred with other human species as they left Africa, but our species evolved in Africa, and all of us, everyone alive today, can trace his or her ancestry back to Africa on some profound level.
Talk to us, if you would, about Samuel Morton.
Well, Samuel Morton was a very prominent, you would call him a scientist. That's kind of anachronistic. The term didn't really exist even at the time. He was a kind of an anthropologist. He's sometimes credited with having almost invented the field of physical anthropology. And he was a doctor, I guess you'd say, who lived in Philadelphia in the middle of the 19th century, so right shortly before the Civil War. And he spent his life, much of his time, collecting skulls, which he got from all over the world. People, from grave robbers, from battlefields, people sent them to him, and he had hundreds of them in this collection. And he would then measure the size of the skull by putting peppercorns into them and then decanting them and seeing how many peppercorns he'd been able to fit into them. And from this elaborate procedure of extremely dubious merit, he concluded he drew up this hierarchy of the races, which was the hierarchy of the races that white Americans had sort of already arrived at, and he also had his own sense of what different races were, which would not entirely correspond to our sense today of races. But of course, he predictably concluded that whites were at the top and blacks were at the bottom. And this is often referred to as the origins of quote unquote scientific racism, which unfortunately had a big impact in the U.S. In the years leading up to and out of the Civil War.
Yeah. Elizabeth Kolbert with us, folks. Quick questions. 866-99-SERIOUS, 866-997-4748. And so, Elizabeth, you're trying to get yourself into trouble, obviously, because not only are you arguing that race is not a real thing, you also talk about, in your piece, write about evolution as well, and the similarities between primates and humans. So you're going to get yourself in trouble with the creationists too,
I
huh?
guess so, yeah. Well, it's hard to talk about genetics without talking about evolution, unfortunately.
So the DNA profiles, there's a photo here of a chimp and a baby.
Mm-hmm.
These DNA profiles are nearly 99% the same?
Yes, we are, very, very, and that's been also known for quite a while now. We are very closely related to chimpanzees, and people have looked at this very carefully. We share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, probably around 6 million years ago. Then there's evidence that are the ancestors of our species, so not humans, but the ancestors of humans, sort of began evolving separately from chimps around that time, and then there's evidence that they interbred once again, after quite a while. So the speciation between chimps and early humans, took a long time, but still today we are very, very closely related to chimpanzees, and anyone who's worked with chimpanzees will tell you how very human-like they are.
You have a section in here too, Elizabeth, ancient flows of dark and light. Talk to us about how melanin colors human skin, if you would.
Well, all that skin color really is a function of how much of a pigment, which is there are different sort of varieties of it, but let's call it melanin. It comes in sort of different flavors, as it were. How much of this pigment you're producing, and different people who have different genetic backgrounds are going to produce different amounts, and that is very highly correlated to where your ancestors are from in terms of sun exposure. So people whose ancestors are from parts of the world close to the equator tend to have dark skin because you need protection from ultraviolet radiation, which can be very damaging to cells. And then as people moved, towards the poles, basically, where sunlight is scarce and it's harder to produce vitamin D, which people need. They tended, once again, and it's a very erratic process because evolution, the way evolution works is through random genetic mutations, and some of these turn out to be useful and tend to get then spread to a population. But one of the really interesting things that's been discovered just in recent years, because we now have very, very sophisticated techniques that can recreate the genomes if we have the right sort of material from people who lived a long, long time ago. So people in Europe, where it's colder, there's a lot of genetic material from ancient Europeans, and one of the things that's been discovered recently is that early Europeans, you might have thought that they were light-skinned, but actually they were dark-skinned. And it wasn't until relatively recently, about 8,000 years ago, that the genes that we now associate with, being white were introduced into Europe actually from the Middle East. So that really completely, changes our view of a lot of things.
Hence, Cheddar Man.
Exactly.
Yeah. And folks are freaking out about that. So where did we get this whole racial construct then? If we're all ultimately the same, who was the person who made the decision, well, we're all different races and then we're going to practice racism and white supremacy? It was, I know you mentioned, Morton kind of a little bit got things going, but he's not really the one responsible.
No, absolutely not. And I actually, I'm gonna confess I don't have an answer for that. I don't think there's someone we can point to. Europeans were trading in slaves from Africa long before Samuel Morton came along, and they justified that to themselves somehow. But who, was there one person? I don't know if we can associate one person with that belief. If you go back and you read Shakespeare from the 16th century, there's a lot of, or there's some discussion, Othello of people of different races and what we would consider racism in there. So it's pretty ancient. How's that?
By analyzing the genes of present-day Africans, our guest Elizabeth Kolbert writes, ladies and gentlemen, researchers have concluded that the Khoisan, who now live in southern, am I pronouncing that correctly, Elizabeth?
Khoisan, yeah.
Khoisan, who now live in southern Africa, represent one of the oldest branches of the human family tree. All non-Africans today, the genetics tell us, are descended from a few thousand humans who left Africa maybe 60,000 years ago. These migrants were most closely related to groups that today live in East Africa, including the Hadza of Tanzania. There's a beautiful graphic of all different shades and colors of African people and people of color. You're right, there's more diversity in Africa than on all the other continents combined. Elizabeth, what you've put together is quite comprehensive and with photographs very beautiful, but it's not the first time we've heard this, and yet things still don't seem to change. We still seem to cling to this construct of race, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that, one of the other pieces in the magazine, which I recommend to your listeners in this special issue on race, is about tribalism. Why do humans have these sort of, tribal instincts which can be manipulated me very easily, as the author of this piece, demonstrates. So, humans do have this sense of the in-groups and out-groups, and, what color your skin is a very visible, marker, as it were. So, why we cling to race, why do we cling to all sorts of outmoded, beliefs is a really interesting question, and may itself have evolutionary, an evolutionary basis. But I think what's really important to understand, and what I think increasingly people do understand, there's also a really interesting cover shot, a beautiful picture of two beautiful twins, little girls, who have the same parents, but who would, if you just asked someone, what race are these two girls, you'd probably say, oh, that girl's white and that girl's black, and that, they have the same parents, right? So it is just completely, when you look at people, as the point of the piece is, when you look at people on a genetic level, these labels don't correspond. They don't have really any meaning. And geneticists do not use it. Geneticists do not use the term race, and they will say to you, race just doesn't have any meaning to us. It doesn't make sense. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have all sorts of ramifications. It doesn't mean that people don't look different. Once again, you have to acknowledge both of those facts.
Yeah. These twins are beautiful, folks. You can see them up on our screen right now. They are beautiful, and these are twins.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're fraternal twins. They're not identical twins, but they're twins. They have the same parents.
Yeah. You also write about Neanderthal DNA and the possibility that we all do descend from that there's still some Neanderthal DNA in all of us, correct?
Well, it's almost not still. It's kind of, again, as it were. I mean, humans, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals diverged, quite a while ago, maybe 800,000 years ago, and then they came together again. Probably, once again, people are not sure where. As people moved out of Africa, they met Neanderthals who were in Europe and in the Middle East and in Asia, and they also met a group, a much more obscure group, who has only been discovered as a result of genetic, what's called paleogenetics, a study of ancient DNA, only been discovered very recently, Denisovans, who were another group of humans. They were humans, and so as humans moved around the world out of Africa, they encountered other groups of humans who were slightly different from themselves, but very very similar. And they had sex with them, and then the offspring of these unions populated the rest of the world, and this includes Asia and North America and Australia. So everyone who's descended from that migration out of Africa has a little bit of Neanderthal or Denisovan, or in many cases both, genetics in them. And their new discoveries are happening all the time. There was just a big paper on this, just the other day. So there's a lot of new stuff that's coming out, and there's a lot of stuff that's going to come out.
Yeah. Elizabeth Kolbert has been our guest. Her latest at National Geographic, and we encourage you all to check out the race issue. It's available online before the print edition. I think National Geographic, Elizabeth, is one of the few publications we all still look forward to in print.
That's why it's such a big deal.
Yeah, thank goodness. All print isn't obsolete just yet.
Exactly.
Thanks to National Geographic. There's no scientific basis for race. It's a made-up label. Elizabeth, any follow-up to this down the road that you're looking at?
No, but it's a really good point. I should. If anyone has any ideas, let me know.
Okay, it's a pleasure to meet you and speak with you, and thank you for this insight. Hopefully, us human beings will get our act together and realize we really are all the same.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we do, we'll thank you for it. Okay.
Well, that would be quite an accomplishment.
All right.
Okay.
Take care. Enjoy your day. Take care now.
You too. Thanks.
Elizabeth Kolbert with National Geographic. Folks, we'll take a quick break. Sirius XM Progress 127, Resistance Radio. Get woke, get ready for impeachment. This is MIP.